Chapter 22. Alex. When we reached the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico, Jonas had previously helped me to my room, and then hitched Christian's decomposing body on his shoulders, laid him on a sheet, and gathered some of the items in my room to weigh him down, then tossed him overboard. Jonas had seen death before, but he never expressed that to me or Max. From what I'd gathered, he'd never killed anyone in cold blood, as they said, but then he had been a soldier and had seen the best and worst part of men's nature. We didn't discuss Christian after the moment I'd heard the splash, and watched the body sink. I do remember him looking like a lost soul when he stumbled from my terrace into my room without a word, looking crushed as if his soul had fallen away. He trod in the direction of the shower, entering, and when he tramped out he had been in it an hour or more. Jonas's expression never changed, and he had a towel wrapped around his waist when he climbed in next to me, and I reached for him, and he laid his head on my breasts while I caressed his head until he fell asleep. I knew how devastating it must have been for Jonas to drag that lifeless body into my room, and heave it over at just the right time. He'd thrown it over and tossed the rope behind I'd used to take everything from Christian, his life. The rope was such a small thing, and it ended Christian's life, I thought, gazing down at Jonas's tortured expression. As Jonas slipped into sleep, and he was at peace, his face changed to the unbelievably handsome man I'd taken for granted. I always considered Max one of the most attractive and desirable men I'd seen in my life. Yet Jonas was an identical twin, and had all the same attributes, but I never saw him the way I'm seeing him now. When the waves tossed the enormous yacht, Jonas rolled closer to me and tightened his grip on my body. The Gulf waters were rough this time of year, but everyone had been sleeping, and the autopilot had been turned on the ship. There were still men working in these early hours to ensure we had a safe voyage and a comfortable one. If anything out of the ordinary had occurred, the captain would have been awakened by the first mate. Jonas had said that the first mate hadn't been as reliable as he should have been, and was probably playing video games when he should have been paying attention to what was going on aboard the vessel. That information had proven to work in our favor. Earlier we watched as Christian's body washed away by the tide and sank. I stared and took a deep breath. What now? I thought. The way Jonas's eyes bore into me, he must have been thinking the same thing, and as always I was the one he looked to for answers, that is when Max wasn't around, and that had occurred more often lately. The crew members who weren't on watch were sleeping below, and there was no one to yell "man overboard," or try to save a man who had been dead for some time. We had gotten lucky. It could have gone the other way, and Jonas and I would have been under house arrest. There was no one to mourn this monster, only two people who he'd tormented and changed their lives forever, and we said goodbye and good riddance to him. Christian should have been stopped years ago when his wives had gone missing, but he had too much money for anyone to care. Now he's missing, and he has too much money for someone not to care, and that's my dilemma. I would have been missed by Max, my children, and Jonas. Jonas would have known who killed me, and he would have been a broken man, but now he can get his life together, and I'll see to that. Max would have been broken, but I didn't doubt that he would have found a way to live without me. However, Christian, had he lived, would have destroyed too many lives, I rationalized. How else could I to live with myself after this? Those were my thoughts when I reached for the nearest lamp to pummel and beat him to death after I choked him. Then I remembered the murder instruments, the lamp wrapped in the sheet with him clutching it, and how I walked behind Jonas and tossed the rope overboard. There, it's over, I'd said to Jonas. But it wasn't over. I knew I would remember this, and carry what I'd done with me everywhere. Every time I looked in Jonas's face, it would remind me of the killing, and what Jonas had done to help me, and how I'd made him complicit in this crime. I would worry if his conscience had gotten the better of him, and he'd confess to the authorities, or to Max. Max was never like Jonas, except they looked the same, strode the same, heads up, shoulders squared, and their long legs and magnificent built bodies taking command of wherever they stepped. However, Jonas had been fragile because of his service. He made wrong choices, wrong decisions because he was a man weakened by tragedy. He'd lost his parents and entire family. He'd lost a woman who loved him. Hell, he lost many women, but it was that last woman he'd married, and he woke to discover that her throat had been cut as he lay beside her when they'd planned to go on their honeymoon, and perhaps had just had sex. Jonas's first wife took their child, leaving him behind, because he was a child himself and he didn't know how to be a husband or a father. When Jonas suggested that I go to my room and wait, and he'd stay with the body after he cleared up some things in the galley, and brought me food, I made my way into my room through a hidden door. I showered, ate, and waited for Jonas to prepare Christian's body to be thrown into deep waters. Before Jonas had showered, and before he'd tossed Christian overboard, and before he'd climbed into bed with me, I glanced over at Jonas as he waited, expecting me to reveal my plans for the future. I had no plans. How could I when I didn't know if covering up a horrible crime would work for the both of us? We could find ourselves in prison for the rest of our lives if the wrong person suspected what we'd done. Hell, if Max was still alive and figured out what we'd done, we still didn't know how he'd react or bail us out. Perhaps he'd put his high-powered lawyers on the case and wash his hands with us. Everything had been on hold until later. But we didn't have later. We needed to talk and come up with alibis, but Jonas didn't want that. He wanted to sleep and forget it until later. I knew if we didn't get our stories straight for Max or the authorities, then what was the use? Jonas could one day look at me and say something out of the ordinary, for example, make a comment as simple as my skin, or talk about the tattoo only Max had seen, and Max would know immediately that the relationship between me and Jonas wasn't the same. That it had evolved into something different. Whenever Jonas looked at me lately, there had been lust in his eyes, and when he'd gotten near me, his breathing would accelerate, his face would blush, and his pupils would be blown. I could hide my feelings, but there was no way Jonas could hide anything from Max. Jonas loved too deeply, and when he fell in love there was no hiding that from anyone. He'd even said, "After this is over, Alex, run away with me. We can take the children." My reply: "Have you lost it, Jonas? You need to think about what you just said. We are in a worse position than we've ever been, and we have nothing to live on. If Max is alive, do you think he will contribute to our elopement? For want of a better word. I will do whatever is necessary to take care of you and the children." That's what I'm afraid of, Jonas. And what about Max? Max will have to accept that you want me and not him, because he was responsible in the first place for all that has happened lately. After that conversation, I climbed into bed distraught and shaken, thinking about what Jonas had said, and knowing Max would go to the ends of the earth to find us, and who knows what would become of all of us before then. When Jonas laid in my arms, it finally hit me what I'd done. I knew myself, and I knew after this the life I knew before would be over. I would break down into pieces and the crying would start, and it would take months for me to stop. It was like that when I discovered my mother had died, and when I thought Max had left me when I had just met him and fallen in love at first sight. I didn't think I'd ever get over my first love, and I haven't. The night before Jonas threw Christian overboard, he stared at me, and I suspected he didn't know what to do now that he had to face himself and his fears. He paced around the room in a circle. I heard a slight mumble, as if he'd been working out what to do in his head. Turning around in bed, I glanced at him pacing back and forward as if he had been in charge of guard duty, and I said, "Jonas, come to bed. You can't walk all night. Worrying will never solve anything." He glared at me with a blank stare and shook his head, as if he never knew me, or had never seen a dead body before. He had checked out for a second, and I had seen him do that in Florida after he'd discovered his lifeless wife lying in the bed on their wedding night next to him. "Come to bed, Jonas. I want you near me. I want to be held tonight," I admitted. It had been too late to pretend we were just friends. It had been too late to pretend things had gotten out of hand and gone too far. I mean, our relationship had crossed that line we knew should never have been crossed, and now we couldn't go back even if we wanted to. Looking like a lost boy who'd been deserted by his mother, Jonas inched closer to the bed, probably wanting comfort and reassurance that tomorrow will get better, and we could forget tonight. I reached for his hand and he allowed me to convince him that life between us was just like before. But it wasn't. We were in love with each other, and we had declared it in more ways than were possible to explain to others. We both had committed crimes that would follow us and bind us to each other for the rest of our lives. I had killed a horrible man, but a man nonetheless, and had been unfaithful to Max. Jonas was getting ready to cover up my crime for me, but that wasn't the worst thing, and we knew it without saying so. He'd committed an unforgivable act. He'd made love to his brother's wife. No matter how we tried to fashion it and convince ourselves that Christian had this coming, and what Christian had forced on us, it couldn't make things right. The passion and love for one another was far greater than we'd anticipated. What would this union do to my children and Max? That would be determined, but first we had to get past these hours and days. No matter how we tried to rationalize what had happened between Jonas and I, Max bore some responsibility because he'd set this in motion. We were responsible for our own actions, and looking at it now, we were in an unbearable position we'd created, and there were no more bodies to cover up or toss away for us to hide our shame of loving each other. "Come closer to me," Jonas said as he reached and dragged me to him. "I just need your comfort and warmth, Alex. It's something about you that makes me feel everything will be better." I offered him a warm smile, and we cuddled in the warmth of each other's arms. I faced him as he dipped his knee into bed. This time, I invited him to bed with me. I was wearing a long black nightgown, and he wore a pair of sweatpants and top. I thought perhaps if we were dressed, things would be different. Maybe we could go back to when we were just friends. It would make things easier on both of us. When Jonas laid beside me, I looked into his wide, hungry eyes, felt his clothed cock against my sheer gown pulsating with need. "It'll be all right, Jonas. Don't worry. I'll figure something out. You need to rest because tomorrow will be a long day, and we both should have our faculties working at full force. You'll be able to think straight if you rest." I spoke soft and low. Lying here looking up at the ceiling and thinking about this isn't good. Relax and let me take off that shirt. You'll be comfortable, and I bet you'll fall asleep. I helped Jonas with his sweats, sliding the top over his wide muscular chest and through his impressive arms. I took a moment to stare at his tattoos, until I felt the heat travel down to my clit. Then I composed myself. And when that was done, he laid on his back and pulled me forward, causing me to fall on top of his terrific hard body. I tried to pull back, but he had me around my waist, and I couldn't move. He smiled, and we locked eyes, and I stared at his handsome face. "Stay in my arms, that's the only way I can rest, knowing you're near me." "Okay," I said softly. And he wrapped his arms around me, and we managed to sleep the night Christian lay dead in his stateroom. Now as Jonas laid his head on my stomach sleeping, his arms wrapped around my middle with me comforting him, I managed to fall asleep. I didn't know what it was that woke me in the middle of the night. I raised my head and looked around and saw that Jonas had moved to the edge of the bed and clutched the pillow. I watched at Jonas sleeping silently, and finally my head was clear and I knew what had to be done. It was like looking at Max, but it wasn't Max, it was Jonas. Max never would have been that insecure. If something had to be done, he did it, and never let his conscience get the best of him. But Jonas was breakable, and he loved deeply and often. He'd once said to me, "I always want to be in love, it lets me know that I'm alive. I love being in love. I love you, Alex." And so he had been in love many times. Like that he was different from Max, even as they were identical twins. Max had declared he'd only been in love once, and it was with me, and he would never leave me, fall out of love with me, or love anyone else. But he had. I thought. And once he discovered our secret, he would never be able to love me again. I guess people change, and when they do, they change the ones they love. Now I was in love with Jonas because Max had changed me. Now I loved Jonas too much to put him in jeopardy by being here, I thought. Therefore I crept from Jonas sleeping hard, lying peacefully. I dressed quietly, listening to hear if he'd wake, and when he didn't as daylight approached, I'd found a pen and paper and wrote one last letter to Jonas. Dear Jonas, I hope you and Max can forgive me, but Christian committed suicide by jumping overboard in the middle of the night, while I slept in bed next to him. I know you will understand because something similar happened to you. You weren't as weak as I had been. On losing your wife you soldiered on, but you see I cannot. Writing this letter has been painful and difficult to put into words. You may not know that I was deeply in love with Christian, and on his death I discovered I couldn't live without him. He satisfied something in me Max never could. I had been living a lie with Max. I thought I would solve this never-ending hunger and addiction I had for Max, but I did with Christian. I married Christian because he was the only man after Max who could satisfy a deep need to be loved, and without him I find I can't go on. It's because of our love for each other, we decided that we couldn't live without each other. He was dying of cancer and revealed his intentions. When I found out about the cancer, I wanted to die too. We cried together, had our last meal together and our last sexual encounter, and now I'm writing this letter. When you read it, I will be with my beloved Christian. You and Max should go on without me because I'm no longer with you and you will never find me. When you read this, I'm at peace and in the sea. Tell my children I love them, and they have at least one parent alive who will love them forever, as I will love them forever. Be strong, Jonas, and carry on for Max and my babies, and remember what you said to me, you love to be in love. You will find someone to fall in love with, so take care of yourself. All my love. Alex. As soon as I realized I had cell reception, I knew I was close to the shore. Then I Googled how many meters it would take to reach the area, and hoped I could swim the distance. I waited until I knew I had an audience, and I calmly strolled on the terrace, leaned over the railing and leapt into the Gulf of Mexico. I didn't call out because I didn't want Jonas to wake and panic, or for anyone stupid enough to try to rescue me. I knew the first mate would have his eyes on the water and dashboard, and his favorite video game. He had too many distractions to think I was anything but a large marlin taking his last leap before disappearing. I was like that marlin, and I hoped I could make it ashore because I had every intentions of seeing my children again, but it wasn't going to be today. Hopefully in the future where they would remember me. Remember the woman I once was, and how much I'd loved them. Max and Jonas would never let them forget me. I hoped. I'd written that letter to give Jonas an alibi, and to throw off anyone who had other ideas in mind. When I began the swim, I didn't know if I could make it to shore, but I would try. If I didn't make it, I thought maybe I'd get my punishment by the hands of nature, and not spend my life in a Mexican jail, because I had no confidence in Jonas pulling off the charade about Christian's death if I was there. Had I stayed, Jonas would have surrendered and confessed to the crime to save me. Coming in 2023, Book 10, Blackout. Below is a bonus book 1, The Incredible Mr. Black. I have included the first book in the series if you haven't read the Blackstone books, and found this book 9, Black Swan, first. At the end of Book 1, you'll find a list of my books in the Blackstone saga.